Somewhere inside every cell in your body is a message. Most of it you already know how to read. But scientists just found a part of it that shouldn't be there. A signal from someone who was never supposed to leave a trace. Not Neanderthal, not Denisovan, something else. Two something elses. And they've been hiding inside human DNA for hundreds of thousands of years. Hiding inside you, until now. By the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly how deep your family tree really goes. And I promise you, it goes a lot deeper and gets a lot stranger than anything you learned in school. Here's the story you probably already know. Somewhere around 50,000 years ago, small bands of our ancestors walked out of Africa, and they were not alone on this planet. In Europe and the Middle East, they ran into the Neanderthals, heavier boned, cold adapted, already living there for hundreds of thousands of years. Further east, in Asia, they crossed paths with a completely different group, one we only know through a handful of fossil fragments, the Denisovans. A pinky bone, a jaw, a few teeth. That's almost the entire physical evidence we have for an entire branch of humanity. But here's the part that still surprises people. Our ancestors didn't just meet these other humans, they had children with them, repeatedly, across thousands of years, across an entire continent. And that means their DNA didn't disappear when they went extinct. It moved into us, and it's been riding along inside human genomes ever since. Today, if your ancestry traces back to Europe or Asia, roughly 1 to 2% of your DNA is Neanderthal. If your ancestry traces to Melanesia or Aboriginal Australia, you can carry up to 4 or 5% Denisovan DNA. For a long time, scientists treated this as the complete picture. Two extinct cousins, two ghosts in the machine, a tidy, if strange, ending. Except the deeper scientists looked, the less tidy that ending became. Because buried inside modern genomes, researchers kept running into DNA that simply didn't fit. It wasn't Neanderthal. It wasn't Denisovan. It didn't match anything ever recovered from a fossil, anywhere, ever. For over a decade, this leftover signal just sat there in the data, unexplained, unnamed, and mostly ignored because nobody had a way to prove what it actually was. Here's the core problem. Every previous ghost in our DNA had eventually been solved the same way. Scientists found a body, an actual skeleton, an actual skull, frozen in permafrost or sealed in a cave, and pulled DNA directly from the bone. That's how we identified Neanderthals. That's how we identified Denisovans, from nothing more than a finger bone in a Siberian cave. But this new signal had no bones behind it. No skull, no skeleton, no cave. Nothing had ever been found, anywhere on Earth, that matched it. Which raises an unsettling question. How do you prove the existence of a human population that left behind absolutely no physical remains at all? How do you identify someone who is, in every sense of the word, a ghost? This is where a team at UC Berkeley, led by molecular biologist Priya Morjani and graduate researcher Yulin Zhang, changed the rules of the game entirely. They built a new technique called TRACE, short for Tracking Archaic Contributions via ARG estimation. And instead of digging through soil, TRACE digs through data. Here's how it actually works in plain terms. Every piece of your DNA has a history, a genealogy, a chain of ancestors stretching back through time, generation after generation. Most of that chain connects back a few thousand years, maybe tens of thousands, completely ordinary. But TRACE builds something called an ancestral recombination graph. Essentially, a family tree not for a person, but for every single fragment of the genome, reconstructed by comparing thousands of genomes from living people all over the world. And when you build that map carefully enough, something strange becomes visible. A handful of fragments, Small, isolated sections of DNA connect back not thousands of years, but hundreds of thousands, even close to 1,000,000 years. Far older than they should be, far older than any known ancestor. These fragments are essentially fossils, except instead of being buried in rock, they're buried in you, hiding in plain sight inside your own genome. The team tested this method first on cases they already understood to make sure it actually worked. And it did. Trace correctly picked out the known Neanderthal segments. It correctly picked out Denisovan segments in genomes from Asia and Oceania, where that ancestry runs highest. That was the proof of concept. Then they pointed the same method at the leftover unexplained fragments, the ones that had puzzled scientists for over a decade. And two separate, distinct, ancient signals emerged from the noise. The first ghost tells an origin story that happened long before humans ever left Africa. This population interbred with our ancestors inside Africa itself, more than 50,000 years ago, before the migration that eventually populated Europe, Asia, and every continent beyond. And that timing changes everything about who carries this DNA, because this isn't a European inheritance or an Asian one. This ghost lineage shows up in African populations and non-African populations in almost identical amounts, which means it isn't a souvenir from some regional encounter after our ancestors left home. It's older than that split. It's in nearly all 8 billion people alive on Earth today, sitting quietly at around 0.5% to 1% of your total genome. Here's the piece that genuinely reframes human history. This lineage split away from the rest of our family tree roughly 800,000 years ago, which puts its origin point remarkably close to the same era when Neanderthals and Denisovans were splitting apart from each other. In other words, at that moment in deep time, there wasn't one human lineage quietly heading toward us. There were several, branching outward almost simultaneously, like separate rivers flowing from the same source. Think about what that actually means for the world these early humans lived in. For hundreds of thousands of years, our species was never alone. There were other kinds of humans, walking the same river valleys, hunting the same herds, sheltering from the same storms, close enough to us, biologically, to have children who survived and thrived. We don't have their skull. We don't have their name. We don't know what they looked like, what language they might have spoken, or what they called the sky. All we have is this, proof written directly into your cells that they were real, and that somewhere, at some point, a member of that population and a member of ours chose each other. And it worked. The second ghost is stranger still, and this is the one that genuinely stopped researchers in their tracks. This lineage doesn't trace back 800,000 years like the first ghost. It traces back roughly 1.8 million years. That places its origin near the very beginning of the genus Homo itself, a population so ancient it likely predates almost every human species we've ever given a name to. But here's the twist that makes this discovery so unusual. This ancient population never appears to have interbred with our direct ancestors at all. Instead, it interbred with the Denisovans deep in Eurasia at some point more than 200,000 years ago. So this million-year-old ghost's DNA entered the Denisovan genome first, becoming part of their genetic makeup. Then, much later, when Denisovans went on to interbreed with our own ancestors, the encounter we already know produced the 1 to 4% Denisovan DNA carried by many people today, a small, buried fragment of that even older, million-year-old ghost hitched a ride along with it. A message passed through 3 different messengers across nearly 2 million years, ending up here, in your genome, right now. To put a number on it, researchers estimate that somewhere between 3 and 5% of the Denisovan genome itself traces back to this super-archaic lineage. Only a fraction of that ever made it into modern humans, since only some Denisovan DNA was passed down to us in the first place. But it's there, a whisper of a whisper, 4 relay runners deep, and it survived. And once again, no name, no fossil, no skull to look at, no face to reconstruct. Just a mathematical shadow, precise enough to date, precise enough to trace, but completely anonymous. Scientists can tell you almost exactly how old this population is. They cannot tell you what it looked like. So who exactly were these two populations? Right now, honestly, nobody knows. Not for certain. But the dates give researchers some educated guesses. The first ghost, splitting off around 800,000 years ago inside Africa, lines up roughly with a group of poorly understood populations from the African Middle Pleistocene. Human relatives we know existed from scattered fossil evidence, but have never been able to sequence DNA from directly. The second ghost, at 1.8 million years old and centred in Eurasia, lines up with the era of Homo erectus, the first of our relatives to leave Africa entirely, spreading as far as Indonesia and China, and surviving in some regions for well over 1 million years. Neither identification is confirmed. That's the honest, slightly uncomfortable truth at the centre of this whole discovery. We have found the genetic echo of 2 populations of ancient humans without having a single bone, tooth, or fragment to put a face to them. Researchers are hoping that future fossil discoveries, or protein sequences pulled from existing Homo erectus remains, might eventually let them close that gap. For now, though, these 2 ghosts remain exactly what the researchers called them: identities without evidence. Evidence without identities. Here's what pushes this discovery beyond a curiosity and into something that actually shaped who you are today. When researchers looked at exactly where in the genome this ghost DNA survived, they noticed it wasn't scattered randomly. It clustered heavily around genes tied to immune defense and metabolism, the systems that protect your body from disease and help it process the food you eat. That clustering is not a coincidence. Adapting to new pathogens and new food sources has been one of the strongest pressures shaping human evolution, generation after generation. When our ancestors interbred with these other populations, they weren't just adding genetic noise, they were absorbing ready-made solutions. Genetic defences these other humans had already spent hundreds of thousands of years evolving for the specific diseases and environments of that time and place. In other words, when your ancestors pushed into unfamiliar territory, unfamiliar climates, unfamiliar illnesses, part of what helped them survive it may have come from someone else entirely, someone whose species no longer exists. In a very real, biological sense, part of the reason you're alive to watch this video is because your ancestors weren't picky about who they fell in love with. We used to picture human evolution as a single, clean tree, one branch leading directly to us. That picture is dead. The real story looks more like a web. Dozens of human populations, meeting, mixing, vanishing, and surviving, not as skeletons behind museum glass, but as living fragments, still active, still working, inside billions of strangers who will never know their names. Somewhere in your body, right now, there is a message from someone who has been extinct for close to 1 million years. For most of history, that message was completely unreadable. Science just learned how to read it. And if researchers can find 2 entire ghost populations hiding in the genomes we already have, the real question isn't whether there are more, it's how many more are still waiting. And what they'll tell us about who we really are. If your ancestors could keep a secret for 1 million years, imagine what's still hidden in your DNA. Subscribe for the next mystery.